Hi, I'm Rhonda Reinhart, Communications Specialist at Heritage Auctions and the editor of our Intelligent Collector magazine. And I'm here today with Dr. Charles Venable. Charles is a former museum curator and director and a scholar in American silver. And he's also a consignor who has contributed 100 lots to our upcoming Fine Silver and Objects of Vertu signature auction that's happening on November 16th. Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about your museum background and your education and what got you interested in silver, especially silver made in America in the late 19th to early 20th century?
Well, in brief, I grew up in Houston and went to Rice University for undergrad and started off in pre-med. And according to my father, made a tragic mistake in taking an art history course. And that changed my life forever. And luckily, the folks at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, where I was an intern, suggested I go to Winterthur because I was interested in objects, and the University of Delaware and Winterthur Museum of Gardens has a great program for that. And that's where I really found out a lot about silver. They had a fabulous teacher on the 18th century and the early 19th, and I really fell in love with metal work, particularly silver objects there, and then went on to do a PhD in Boston.
Oh, nice. And so when you were doing your PhD in Boston, you turned your dissertation into the book Silver in America. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
25 pounds of too much information.
It's 25 pounds? Wow.
Oh, well, you're holding it.
Yeah, it is heavy.
It did sell 13,000 copies, which astounded me at the time.
Well, it is fascinating, and the images in it are beautiful too. Lots of detail on
that was done when I was a young curator at the Dallas Museum of Art, and they had a wonderful objects photographer who shot all those images, at least the ones that were in the Dallas Museum of Art's collection, where I worked for 16 years before going on to Cleveland and to Indianapolis and to Louisville as deputy directors and directors.
Now, before you got into your PhD and writing this book, there was a lot of interest in silver collecting, but it was mostly colonial. Is that right?
There's really nice silver that was made in the colonial era, but America was comparatively speaking, a fairly poor colony for a long time. So there wasn't a wealthy clientele urging makers to make what they couldn't sell in places like London and Paris at the time. And in the 19th century, that really changed as America became a really rich world power. Starting to lead in industry and other things like that. And the silver industry followed along and became very industrialized, and the quality shot up dramatically by the 1840s and 50s. And that's really when I start getting enormously interested in silver, is in that second half of the 19th century on until about the 1920s or so, when the market began to change directions and people stopped buying silver as much.
And with your interest, some other people got interested too. So now collecting silver in this era is really popular.
Yes, there are lots of collectors now. Originally, though, in the 1980s, when I was beginning to write about this and do a lot of research, there were really just a handful of extremely serious and sophisticated collectors in the sense that they were buying 19th and early 20th century silver. Most people were still collecting earlier material. Or buying silver used on the table, which is perfectly great. So there was a spectacular auction of Sam Wagstaff's collection in New York. And that really, along with research that some of us were doing, including my book, really made the market come alive. And through the 1990s, wow, the market was very hot. And that's where you start getting collectors understanding more, reading more, owning more objects, such as the things that I have being sold by you at Heritage.
These engravings on some of these pieces are so intricate and beautiful and just amazing to look at.
The more elaborate it is, the more detailed it is. I tend to like those objects very, very much. They were just such miracles to be able to be made. And today there would be almost nobody on the planet who would know how to make them.
Well, you touched on something there that I wanted to talk about. So when you started building your personal collection, I thought this was so interesting that you looked at each piece from a curator's point of view, because that's how you were trained. So every piece in your collection is rare in some way or special. You didn't just, buy things to buy things. They had to be something that would stand on their own and could be worthy of a museum exhibition.
Well, you have 100 lots. being sold, which is a lot. I mean, I never had 200 pieces of silver, but I did have more things that my husband and we've already gifted to various museums. And so some of them are on display in some of America's greatest museums. Other ones are up for sale. I'm downsizing to a condo of 1,400 square feet from a fairly large house at my last directorship job. And so there's just no way I can use them, display them the way I used to. And so I'm really happy that other people will be able to enjoy these objects when they're sold on the 16th at Heritage.
And those people are very happy too that they're going to be able to get their hands on some of your wonderful objects. So speaking of the objects, let's get into some of these things. This is what people want to see. One of the first things that we wanted to talk about was this wonderful William Gale and Son tray that's got these wonderful engravings of exotic animals and architectural scenes. Can you talk a little bit about this one?
It's made by William Gale, who was a major maker in the 19th century. And it's actually, he's one of the few American makers who dated his pieces with a little stamp, so that we know this was made in 1851. And not only is it enormous, a very big silver tray with big handles on it. So it's impressive just for its scale and its weight in silver. But the reason I wanted this tray, and it's gone through auction a couple of times and done very, very well, was because of the amazing engraving that's on it. And it has things that you'll immediately recognize and some you won't. Like right now, we're focusing on this extraordinary leopard that's up in the crotch of a tree looking down like he's just going to pounce on you. And nobody, to my knowledge, ever knew where the engraver got all these images. And I literally have spent like almost 2 years trying to track them all down. So the leopard, for example, came out of an 1833 English magazine, whereas now you can see sort of at the top center, a little over to the right, a beaver just having cut down a tree trunk. And we know that came out of a 19th century version of Oliver Goldsmith's A History of Earth and Animated Nature, which was first published in 1774. And there's actually a near complete set of his books that will be sold with this tray. And many of the animals that you can see here came out of later editions when they beefed up the number of plates in them as printing became easier during the 19th century. And if you scroll down a little bit, you'll see Thomas Jefferson's home Monticello. And I found out that is came from an engraving that was published in an early American magazine as well. So I just kept going from one to the other and staying up late on the internet trying to find out where these engravings came from. And then there's right in the center, that's Mount Vernon, George Washington's home. And it's a very unusual view where you see the portico in the front porch of that house, as opposed to seeing it head on. And that was done by a painter in the 1830s, as I remember. And eventually, but that image was published as an engraving. And I'm sure that's where the engraver of this incredible masterpiece tray got that unusual view of Mount Vernon. So this truly is a museum-worthy object. When it was on exhibition at the Indianapolis Museum of Art, it looked really quite spectacular. In fact, it was hung on the wall like a painting, not flat like a tray.
Oh, wow. How interesting. I can definitely see why. So when you started to talk about all the research you did, it reminded me of the fact that as you got into silver and started researching it, you not only became a scholar of silver, but you also had to become a scholar of American history because you learned so much about the history of our country by researching all these individual pieces.
Silver just fires my imagination to know more about the history of our nation. And actually, when I went to Rice doing pre-med, my other minor was American history. So I was always interested in American history, and it was great to find a type of object that really, through its engravings, through the monograms, through the families that owned these things and how they were used, really took me off, you might say, down rabbit holes looking for unusual stray things. But something like the tureen that belonged to the First Lady of Cuba that is in the sale. I mean, I'm not a Cuban scholar, so I didn't know that much about Cuban history, particularly 20th century history. So really it was fabulously, I mean, it's a fabulous object. It's a great Tiffany model covered with peonies. It even has some little chicken heads on it that you can find on the handles in person. But the underside is engraved with the name of Marta Fernandez Batista. And that was not a name I was overly familiar with, but the dealer I bought this from pointed out to me that that's the name of the last First Lady of Cuba, who was with her husband, President Batista. They were the President and First Lady from 1952 to 1959 when the revolution in Cuba happened. And she only died in 2006. And eventually she settled, after she had to leave Cuba with her husband, she settled in Florida. So I suspect this came out of her estate somewhere after she died in 2006 and made it into the antiques market. But I was just thrilled to be able to do research on this and actually find photographs. This lot has photographs of the very, very attractive. She sort of looks like Jackie O in a way, she's coming off the airplane in Idlewild in New York, which is what LaGuardia used to be called. And she's very, very fashionable. So I certainly imagine that she liked silver as well and was very pleased enough with this piece that she had her name engraved on the bottom of it.
This was my absolute favorite piece in the entire.
Oh, it's terrific.
Yeah. Okay, now we've got a tea and coffee service, and this one's really cool because this is the Art Deco one.
Oh, this is the Wallace set, the big set that has its original tray. And this I was inspired to collect, as often happens. Like I was able to find, one of these came to the Dallas Museum of Art when we acquired the Jewel Stern collection. She's a major, major collector of silver who lives in Florida. And we were very interested in filling in the 20th century for Dallas's incredible collection of American silver. And so her whole collection came there and it included one of these sets. And I totally fell in love with it. And museums do encourage, if they want to, their staffs to collect art. And so it wouldn't be competition for me to be looking for one of these when I was at Dallas, because they already had one. So it would have been a duplicate. So they wouldn't want a second one. So I never thought I'd be able to find these. One like this, because they're incredibly rare. The Art Deco style, as you probably know, really developed in Paris starting in 1925. And by the time Americans paid attention and they were starting to make things like this, for example, this set was made in 1929. And what else happened in 1929? The entire world economy fell apart, the stock market crashed. And all of a sudden people, even wealthy people who still had some money left after the stock market crashed, pretty much stopped buying silver. It was just a luxury good they could live without for a while. And this has brilliant lines, beautiful Bakelite finials on it. It's very rare to find a tray that matches. And however, there were very few of these made. In fact, this is the second one I've ever seen and much less able to buy. And it was just a fluke really that I was able to find this object, but it did take 15 years of looking.
Oh, wow. That is amazing. And you are keeping some of your Art Deco pieces.
Yes, my condo isn't very large, but I certainly love silver and other objects. So there are a handful of things my husband and I have picked up. Not a lot though.
Yeah.
Most of it is in your hands or it's already gone to museums.
Okay, the next one is another really intricate one, the Stebbins & Co. Temple tea set. Yeah.
Oh, that's also one of my favorite. I would, if you like the first half of the 19th century, I would put this in a masterpiece category too. There is one very similar to it. The finials are different and the engraving somewhat different, but being in the shape of little ancient Greek or Roman temples, octagonal temples, is the same on the set that's at the Bayou Bend collection at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, where it's been on loan for quite some time. And then there's one or two other pieces that have shown up that are somewhat related, but it's really the set that's at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston and the one that's coming up in this sale that are complete in having a teapot, creamer, and sugar. And I just, for about 1850 in the United States, this is pretty extraordinary that this was made in this country. It has the columns, and between each of the columns, there are actually, if you can zoom in maybe on the bottom of a piece between the columns, You can see that they're basically scenes, rural landscape scenes of boating, of little romantic bridges, of churches, of little castles. And so it really talks about the mid-19th century's love of the landscape. I mean, that's when places like Central Park were being built so that you could walk out and enjoy nature, as opposed to much of the 18th century where we were, cutting down trees in order to try to colonize this whole country, this whole continent. Whereas this is much more about gardening and the love of going to the park and to the seashore. It's really an extraordinary piece of work from about 1850.
And it's definitely a more is more example.
Oh yes, definitely more is more. And when you have coffee, you have coffee or tea in the pot and cups and saucers and napkins and scones or whatever you're feeding your guests, it becomes even more than more. It's really very fun.
Yeah. And it's so fascinating that the rarity of this piece and some of the other pieces you have, that how much work you had to put in and years of research to find them. It's very incredible.
It's true. And sometimes, I mean, certainly some of these came from very well-known dealers, but other ones were like, I'm slight insomniac. So when I'm not doing research, like trying to track down some stray animal on a tray, I often just scroll through listings on eBay. And because some of these things are very obscure to a typical person, you just have to go through, you can't type in, Templeform T6. Nobody categorized it that way. So I've scrolled through literally probably millions of images online of silver in small auctions and things like that, and estate sales, in order to be able to pick out some things that are like, wow, I thought I'd never see one of those, or I have never seen one of those, and be able to acquire some of these objects.
Yeah, true treasures. So the next thing on our list is another tea and coffee service set, and it's an Egyptian revival silver.
Oh, this is really over the top. And of course, I like over the top in this period. So this is a set that is marked by Ball Black and Company, which was the great rival to Tiffany during the 1860s and 70s. This is made around 1870 or so. And they had a fancy showroom down on Lower Broadway. And actually, the building still exists in New York. And their secret weapon, though I don't have documented proof that he made this, in my heart, I am sure he probably did. There was a German immigrant silversmith named John Wendt, W-E-N-D-T, who worked upstairs in the Ball Black and Company building, and he made some of their greatest stuff. And I would lay money on it that he is responsible for this extraordinary Egyptian revival tea set. And if you can zoom in on the portrait, say right down on the bottom, right there. I mean, look at that. That's no Egyptian pharaoh you've ever seen. And in some ways, it probably is a fanciful image of what somebody thought a Persian king looked like or something like that. But you can see the sort of lotus engraving coming up, and the triangles like pyramids, and the whole piece is covered in cast elements and engraving in pristine condition. They're the monograms. I don't know what the family name was that owned this. What I do know is I bought this, though, in York, England, not in the United States. And while the dealer wouldn't tell me her name, he said the very elderly woman who had him sell it for her father was a businessman who went to New York all the time. And I'm assuming he bought this in New York because he thought it was so fabulous, and then took it to England, which is interesting because the English have made great silvers for centuries. And so it's sort of wonderful that somebody loved the American stuff better and took it back to Europe with him.
Okay, let's move from coffee and tea to whiskey. This is a super fun object, the Gorham Flask. Tell us about this one.
Oh, the flask. Wow. So this is a great example of when I was an intern at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, they acquired a flask just like this with a different recipient's name on it. And I thought this was the coolest object. And it's actually quite big. So if you're a good Texas collector and you want to go to the OU Texas football game in Dallas, this would get you through a nice chunk of the game for sure if you really put Scotch whiskey or something in this. But the history in brief, there was a guy named Alex Shepard, and he was a successful businessman, but frankly, from what I read, sort of a crooked businessman. And eventually he, in some ways, might have gotten run out of the United States. And he went to northern Mexico, ended up owning a silver mine, which is this side of the flask actually is a picture of the silver mine. He took a photograph and sent it to the Gorham Company in Providence, and they literally engraved that picture right on the side. And you see the cactus that would be native for northern Mexico, and agave, where we get tequila on the bottom of it. And that's his silver mine. It's not impossible that he shipped a trainload of silver to Gorham to have 15 of these flasks made. I only personally have tracked down 5 of them, 4 of which are in museums, including the Smithsonian. And then on the other hand, he didn't want you to forget who was giving you this expensive object, because his portrait is on the side of it. And then the name of the people who he gave it to in 1888 are engraved on the lower this side too. And this is A.H. Sawyer, and he was the president of the Boston and Florida Land Company. So a business wheeler dealer, a speculator, if you will, who Shepard might have been a friend with, but it's also he might have been sort of trying to butter up the person he gave this to, so that he could cut some business deals with him and get favorable treatment. So, but a fabulous object, really, really great.
I love it. It's so fun.
Yeah, and you can see in that shot the little rectangle with a number, which indicates it was a special order for Mr. Shepard. That's one of the codes that if you're really into Gorham silver, you would memorize, knowing that when you see that, it's like, oh my gosh, this was made special for somebody. There was not a whole bunch of other ones of these that somebody else could order.
Okay, we have another Gorham piece that has an interesting provenance. It belonged to Senator William Andrews Clark of Montana. Is that right?
Senator Clark was quite the eccentric, very successful though person. So he was a young man who went out to Montana and ended up cornering a large part of the copper business. Montana's famous for its copper mines. And he ended up owning several of them, became the equivalent of a billionaire robber baron of the 19th century. In the very late 19th century, he moved, though he kept a house in Montana, he moved to New York after he was elected senator from the state of Montana, and built this incredible house that I think a book on the family that shows the house on the cover. There it is, called Empty Mansions. So that's the house that this coffee pot and sugar bowl used to be in. And you might ask, well, where's the creamer? And I can tell you, I have looked high and low. I will bet it's out there somewhere and might pop up. But this is part of 100+ pieces that he ordered for the dining and living room and breakfast room of that big mansion you just saw. And it's one of the most important sets of silver of that scale ever made in this country. And yet almost nobody knows about it. We were fortunate at the Dallas Museum of Art when I worked there to acquire the tureen and stand that it sits on from this set, which is quite spectacular as well. But he died in 1925, and in 1927, his estate was sold, that house was sold, everything was dispersed out of the house. And he didn't have his name. It doesn't say Senator Clark or Clark on it. And so this stuff sort of masquerades in the market out there as just extremely beautiful pieces of handmade silver from Gorham, but almost nobody knows who it's by. And this one, I did buy this without proof that it was from Senator Clark, but it so reminded me of the tureen at the Dallas Museum of Art that eventually my friends at the Gorham Archives were able to look up the numbers, and they said, sure enough, it did come from that great silver service.
I love that we had a picture there of the mansion, because when you see that house and when you see these pieces, you can almost envision the dinners and the parties and the breakfasts that took place there. It's
totally true. In fact, the oak paneling in the dining room has the same decoration that the tea sets have on it. I think the designer at Gorham worked with the decorator of the house, so that it was the ultimate in like rich fantasy living, where all of your silverware matched all the decor in your dining room, down to the last little flower. It's kind of amazing.
Oh, I love that detail. Okay, our next item is pretty cool too. It's different because it's this Marcus bowl that has stones inlaid on the handles.
Total opposite in taste. In fact, these are great comparisons in terms of, so in 1910, you could have a very wealthy person ordering a very elaborate coffee set like the one we just saw, with all kinds of decoration on it from the 17th century. And then those people who thought that was gaudy and old taste, that they just too much more was more, here is less is more, starting off with the arts and crafts period. And this is probably almost exactly contemporary, maybe 1905, maybe a few years earlier, but very close to that coffee pot. And if you didn't know, if you didn't see the marks on this, knowing that this was made by Marcus and Company in New York, a silver person would pick this up and say, this has to be made in England, because it is completely related to extraordinary bowls like this and cups like that are similar to this than just have one handle, that were made by Charles R. Ashby, one of the greatest silver designers England ever produced, and one of the most important people of the arts and crafts movement, which is what we call plainer silver like this from the early part of the 20th century. And to my knowledge, there are 3 similar bowls, including this one. This one's from New York. The other 2, I believe, if I remember correctly, were both made in Boston. And they all have cabochon semi-precious stones. These I think are jade, but I've never had them tested, so I don't know for sure. But an extraordinary example, a very rare example of American arts and crafts silver. Very
nice. So the next thing we want to talk about is, okay, I love the tureen that belonged to the First Lady of Cuba. It is my favorite, but this is probably my second favorite. The Gorham Melon serving set. This little knife and fork was made especially just to serve slices of melon. That is just wonderful to me.
Well, everybody needs to have special silver inlaid objects to serve their cantaloupe with these days, I think. And I must admit, these are so beautiful, and it's so rare to have examples, because you would think they're by Tiffany, because Tiffany is famous for mixing metals, silver, copper, gold together. And it's pretty unusual in Gorham or other companies' work. And when I found these at a Philadelphia dealer, I found that they were Gorham. I was sort of astonished. And then I wasn't quite sure what that fork was for, because it looks highly specialized, sort of unusual shape. But eventually I was able to find in the Gorham archives an exact set, a plain set that didn't have all this great decoration. And it very specifically said these were melon servers, a serving set for cutting up and serving a melon at a very fancy table. And I love flatware. It's one of the things that I've been able to afford some very nice flatware, because I mean, some flatware sells for a very large amount of money, but some flatware doesn't. And it's a great place for young collectors or people who want to collect extraordinary American silver, but not spend, $50,000 on an object. These would probably sell very reasonably, but they are extraordinary little things. And I've never seen another set like these ever in 40 something years. They might be out there. If so, you're very lucky people.
I love that you brought that up, that these smaller items like this are a good entry point for beginning collectors or people who are just maybe thinking they might be interested in silver. This is a great way to get into it.
It's true. And silver, there's some really great examples of silver plate in this sale too. And there's a lot of collectors who say, if it's not sterling, I don't want to buy it. Whereas I was never that way, because in my mind, I was always sort of thinking about, as a curator, how do you tell the story? I was never planning to like melt this stuff down. So it really didn't matter so much how many ounces of silver were in it. And there's some great silver plate that'll, I'm sure, sell very reasonably. I bought it fairly reasonably in this sale as well, particularly Gorham stuff, which made some of the best silver plate in the world in the 1860s and 70s.
Well, we have one more thing that we wanted to talk about, and this picture that's the last on our list is interesting because, like you said to me a while back, if it were just a regular picture, the shape that it would be extremely ordinary. But because of how it is decorated and engraved is what lured you in.
So this is a shape of picture that was quite popular. So if you look around for Gorham, sterling pictures from the 1860s, you will find pictures that are of the shape of this. However, most of them aren't decorated, or they have very little decoration, or maybe just a monogram on them. And I was not interested in a piece like that. Whereas when this popped up, it was like just blew my socks off, because I had never. I mean, I've looked at literally probably hundreds of thousands of pieces of silver in my career, and I'd never seen engraving coming out of the Gorham company that was exactly of this style and all over. So it's not just engraved; it's actually what we call chased engraving. And so if you look on the inside of this picture, you can see where the tool slightly dented into the silver in order to make those deeper lines there in the decoration. But just it took somebody hundreds of hours probably to decorate this one picture. And the only other piece I've ever seen that I would believe is engraved by this master engraver chaser is a small little mug out there that was pretty beat up, so I wouldn't buy it. But an amazing object that you can easily use on your table. You could serve water in it, which probably most people did, but it's also great with, a gallon of wine, your tequilas, your vodkas, all kinds of good things for a fun 4th of July or a great party.
Well, that's what's so great about all of these pieces. They're completely functional today. Unlike a lot of antique collectibles and different things you can't use, you just have to look at them.
Silver is a precious metal. And a lot of people care about how many ounces there are in a certain object. For centuries, one of the reasons some people have loved silver and gold is because they are precious metals that humans value, and therefore they tend to hold their value over time quite well, as opposed to maybe a piece of glass or a piece of furniture or something like that, which the market might be a little more unstable for over long periods of time.
Right. Well, Charles, I so appreciate you being here today. And once again, everyone, the sale is coming up on November 16th, and Charles has 100 separate lots in the sale, and you've only seen a sampling of them. There are 90 others that are just as rare and beautiful, and we can't wait for you to see them all and get your bids in.
And I hope everybody who becomes the new owners of these objects have as much fun as I have collecting them and using them over the
I have
last
no
20,
doubt.
30 years.
Yes, I'm sure they will.